Margaret stood at her kitchen window on a cold November morning, watching the maple trees shed their last golden leaves onto the quiet suburban street of Brookline, Massachusetts. At 50, she had learned that silence often spoke louder than words, and lately, silence had become her closest companion. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee into her favorite ceramic mug, the one her late mother had given her 20 years ago. The aroma filled the kitchen, but it couldn't warm the chill that had settled in her chest since yesterday's phone call from Linda. Her sister-in-law's voice still echoed in her mind, sharp and dismissive, explaining why Margaret's children wouldn't be welcome at Thanksgiving dinner this year. Linda had cited space constraints, though Margaret knew the dining room at her brother's house could easily seat 20 people. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had written the check for the entire meal just 2 weeks prior, transferring $1,500 to cover everything from the organic turkey to the expensive wine Linda insisted upon. Margaret walked to the refrigerator and stared at the family photo held by a magnet, taken last Thanksgiving when everyone still pretended to be happy. Her 2 children, Emma and David, stood beside her, their smiles genuine despite the tension that always simmered beneath these gatherings. She had spent 30 years trying to be the peacemaker, the reliable one, the sister who could be counted on to write checks and swallow complaints. The morning light cast long shadows across her hardwood floors, and she wondered how many more mornings she would wake up feeling invisible in her own family. Her brother Richard had said nothing when Linda made the decision, his silence a vote of agreement that cut deeper than any words could. Margaret had married into expectations, divorced out of necessity, and somehow remained trapped in the role of the family's quiet benefactor. She thought about calling her children to break the news, but Emma was already at college in Vermont, and David was teaching at a high school in Connecticut. They had their own lives now, their own Thanksgivings to build, and she didn't want to burden them with the dysfunction she had shielded them from for so long. Margaret took another sip of coffee and made a decision that would change everything. That afternoon she would attend the dinner alone, smile through the humiliation and observe carefully who her family really was when they thought she wasn't paying attention. But she would also document everything, every slight, every moment of disrespect. Because Margaret had finally learned that sometimes the only way to become visible was to stop being convenient. The truth had a way of revealing itself when you stopped trying to hide it. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving had been particularly difficult for Margaret, with her freelance editing work piling up as deadlines approached. She worked from her home office, a converted sunroom overlooking the backyard where squirrels performed their acrobatic routines on the bird feeders. The steady income from her work had allowed her to remain financially independent after the divorce. Though Richard often dismissed her career as just editing whenever family discussions turned to accomplishments, Margaret had spent the previous weekend shopping for gifts for Linda's children, her niece and nephew who barely acknowledged her presence at family gatherings. She had chosen expensive items from their wish lists, wrapping them carefully in metallic paper that caught the light. The gifts sat in her hall closet now, a reminder of her perpetual attempt to buy affection she would never genuinely receive. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Patricia asking about Thanksgiving plans and offering to include Margaret in her family's celebration if needed. Patricia was one of the few people who understood the complicated dynamics of Margaret's family, having witnessed several awkward holiday encounters over the years. Margaret appreciated the offer, but declined, knowing that she needed to see this through. To finally understand the depth of her family's disregard, the temperature dropped as evening approached, and Margaret prepared a simple dinner for herself, pasta with vegetables and a glass of red wine. She ate slowly at her dining table, the same table where she had hosted countless family dinners that no one ever offered to reciprocate. The silence in her house felt heavy but honest, unlike the forced conversations that would fill Richard's home on Thursday. She opened her laptop and reviewed her bank statements, calculating how much she had contributed to family events over the past 5 years. The number shocked her, nearly $40,000 spent on holidays, birthdays, emergency loans that were never repaid, and various crises that only she seemed financially equipped to handle. Margaret had never asked for gratitude, but she had hoped for basic respect, for acknowledgement that she was more than just a checkbook. As she closed the laptop, Margaret noticed the stack of photo albums on her bookshelf, filled with memories of happier times when their parents were still alive. Back then, family meant something different, something warmer and more genuine. She wondered when exactly things had changed. When she had become the invisible sister whose feelings didn't matter as long as her wallet remained accessible to everyone else's needs and expectations. Thursday morning arrived with frost coating the windows and a pale sun struggling to break through gray clouds. Margaret dressed carefully in a burgundy sweater and black slacks, applying makeup with more precision than usual, as if armor could be built from foundation and lipstick. She stood before her bedroom mirror, looking at the woman who stared back, searching for the strength she would need to walk through Richard's front door. The drive to her brother's house took 30 minutes through neighborhoods decorated with autumn wreaths and colorful corn stalks. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly, rehearsing conversations in her mind, imagining different scenarios of how the evening might unfold. Part of her hoped that Linda would surprise her with an apology, that this had all been a terrible misunderstanding that could be laughed about over pumpkin pie and coffee. She pulled into the familiar driveway at exactly 4 o'clock, the time Linda had specified in her phone call. Margaret could see movement through the large bay window, family members already gathered in the living room. She recognized her cousin Jennifer's laugh, the sound carrying into the cold afternoon air. Taking a deep breath, Margaret grabbed the wine she had brought and walked toward the front door, her heart pounding. Linda answered after the first knock, her smile bright and artificial, the kind of expression that never reached her eyes. She welcomed Margaret with air kisses and took the wine without comment, immediately turning to greet another arriving guest. Margaret stepped into the entryway, overwhelmed by the smell of roasting turkey and the sound of conversations happening in rooms she couldn't yet see, feeling already like an intruder in a space her money had helped create. The living room buzzed with activity as relatives clustered in small groups, drinks in hand, sharing stories and laughter that paused awkwardly when Margaret entered. Her brother Richard stood by the fireplace deep in conversation with their Uncle Tom and barely glanced in her direction. Margaret smiled and nodded at familiar faces, receiving polite but distant acknowledgments, the social equivalent of being patted on the head and dismissed. She found her way to the kitchen where Linda was directing operations with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. The counters overflowed with dishes Margaret had paid for, the expensive china Linda had insisted was necessary for a proper Thanksgiving. Margaret offered to help, but Linda waved her away dismissively, saying everything was under control and suggesting she should go mingle with the guests, treating her like a visitor rather than the person who had funded this entire elaborate production. Dinner was served at 6 o'clock around a table extended to its full length and decorated with Linda's signature fall centerpieces. Margaret found herself seated at the far end, next to Richard's teenage daughter who spent the entire meal scrolling through her phone. Conversations flowed around her. Stories were shared and jokes were told, but no one directed questions her way or included her in discussions, as if she occupied a chair without actually existing in the room. The food was excellent, everything prepared to perfection, and Margaret mechanically moved portions around her plate while observing the dynamics around her. She noticed how Linda touched Richard's arm affectionately when he complimented the turkey, how Jennifer and her husband shared private smiles across the table, how even the children seemed more engaged with each other than anyone had been with her since she arrived, making her feel like a ghost at her own family's feast. When someone mentioned the cost of organic ingredients and how expensive Thanksgiving had become, Margaret waited for Richard or Linda to acknowledge her contribution, but neither said anything. The conversation moved on to holiday sales and vacation plans, and Margaret realized with stark clarity that her generosity had been absorbed without gratitude. Expected rather than appreciated, her financial support taken as her assigned role rather than a gift freely given. As dessert was being served, Margaret excused herself and walked to the bathroom upstairs, needing a moment away from the performance she had been maintaining. She stood at the sink looking at her reflection again, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes and the tight set of her jaw. Through the closed door, she could hear laughter and music starting downstairs, the party continuing without missing her presence for even a moment. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos of Emma and David, reminding herself of what truly mattered in her life. Her children had grown into kind, thoughtful adults despite the dysfunction surrounding them, and they loved her genuinely, not for what she could provide, but for who she was. Margaret sent them each a quick text saying she loved them, then took several deep breaths before returning downstairs to finish what she had started. The evening stretched on with card games and reminiscing about past holidays when their parents had hosted stories that conveniently glossed over any difficult memories or uncomfortable truths. Margaret participated minimally, answering when spoken to directly, but mostly observing, cataloging each slight and dismissal, each moment that confirmed what she had suspected, that she had become nothing more than an ATM with a pulse to these people who shared her blood. Around 10 o'clock, guests began leaving and Margaret used the exodus as her opportunity to escape. She thanked Linda for hosting, the words tasting bitter on her tongue, and hugged Richard goodbye, noting how quickly he released her, as if prolonged contact might obligate him to actual emotion or acknowledgement of her hurt. Linda was already clearing dishes when Margaret left, not even walking her to the door. The drive home felt longer than usual, darkness pressing against her car windows as streetlights flickered past. Margaret's hands shook slightly on the steering wheel, not from cold but from the release of tension she had been holding throughout the evening. She had survived the humiliation, witnessed the truth of her place in the family hierarchy, and now she had to decide what to do with the clarity that came from being systematically ignored. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, engine off, staring at her house with its single porch light burning. The silence inside her vehicle felt peaceful compared to the noise she had just escaped, and Margaret understood that she had been searching for home in the wrong places. Home wasn't where you were tolerated, it was where you were cherished, and she had been homeless among family for far too long. Inside, Margaret made herself tea and settled on her couch with a notebook, beginning to write down everything she had witnessed and felt throughout the evening. The act of documentation felt cathartic, transforming her pain into something concrete and undeniable. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with these observations, but she knew that silence had protected nothing and no one except those who had grown comfortable disrespecting her. The weekend passed quietly as Margaret processed her Thanksgiving experience and considered her options. She called Emma on Friday, and her daughter immediately sensed something was wrong despite Margaret's attempts to sound cheerful. Emma had always been perceptive, able to read emotions in her mother's voice that others missed completely. They talked for an hour, and Margaret finally shared what had happened, including Linda's prohibition against her own children attending. Emma was furious, her voice rising with each new detail Margaret revealed, demanding to know why her mother had tolerated such treatment. Margaret tried to explain the complicated dynamics of family loyalty and obligation, but even as she spoke, the justifications sounded hollow and unconvincing. Emma insisted they needed to confront Richard and Linda, but Margaret asked her to wait, saying she wasn't ready yet for that conversation or confrontation. David called later that day, having heard from Emma, and his response was quieter but equally angry. He reminded Margaret that she had taught them to stand up for themselves, to never accept disrespect from anyone, and now she needed to follow her own advice. His words struck deep because they were true, and Margaret promised to think carefully about her next steps, knowing that whatever she decided would fundamentally change her relationship with Richard forever. Margaret spent Sunday morning at her favorite coffee shop, watching families and couples enjoy their weekend rituals. She observed interactions with new awareness, noticing how people treated each other, who paid attention and who was dismissed, seeing patterns of respect and disregard play out in small, everyday moments. The world was full of Lindas and Richards, people who took without giving, who expected without appreciating, and she had been enabling their behavior by accepting it. That afternoon, she drafted an email to her brother, writing and rewriting her thoughts, trying to find words that expressed her feelings without attacking or blaming. She described her experience on Thanksgiving, how it felt to be excluded and invisible despite funding the event, and asked him directly if he understood how his silence had hurt her. Margaret read the email 20 times before saving it as a draft, not yet ready to send it but needing to articulate her truth. She called Patricia that evening and they met for dinner at a local Italian restaurant where Margaret finally allowed herself to fully express her anger and hurt. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze Margaret's hand, offering the comfort of genuine friendship. When Margaret finished, Patricia said simply that she deserved so much better, that she had always deserved better, and it was time to stop waiting for family to recognize her worth. They discussed practical steps Margaret could take, from setting clear boundaries to completely cutting financial support for family events. Patricia reminded her that saying no was a complete sentence, that she didn't owe anyone explanations or justifications for protecting herself. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of obligations she had carried for decades. Permission to finally prioritize her own well-being over everyone else's comfort and expectations. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Jennifer, her cousin, who had been at Thanksgiving. Jennifer sounded uncomfortable, but determined, explaining that she had noticed how Margaret was treated and wanted to apologize for not speaking up. She revealed that several family members had commented on Linda's behavior afterward, recognizing the cruelty even if they hadn't intervened in the moment, and Jennifer thought Margaret should know she had allies. This information surprised Margaret, who had assumed everyone was complicit in her invisibility. But Jennifer explained that Richard and Linda dominated family gatherings with such strong personalities that disagreeing with them felt risky. Most relatives had learned to stay quiet to avoid conflict, prioritizing peace over justice, and Margaret realized she had been doing exactly the same thing for years, accepting unacceptable treatment to maintain an illusion of family harmony. Jennifer offered to talk to Richard herself, to advocate for Margaret, but Margaret declined, knowing this was a conversation she needed to have directly. However, Jennifer's call gave her courage, confirmation that she wasn't imagining the disrespect, that others had witnessed it too. Sometimes validation was enough to transform doubt into determination, and Margaret felt her resolve strengthen with each passing hour and honest conversation. She opened her laptop and retrieved the draft email to Richard, reading it with fresh eyes. The words were honest but measured, expressing hurt without hysteria, asking for accountability without demanding punishment. Margaret added a final paragraph about her own responsibility in enabling this dynamic, acknowledging that she had trained people to treat her poorly by accepting their mistreatment for so long, but stating clearly that pattern ended now. Her finger hovered over the send button for several minutes as Margaret considered the potential consequences. This email would change everything, would force Richard to either acknowledge his behavior or defend it, and either response would reveal truths she couldn't unknow. But staying silent meant remaining invisible, and Margaret had finally learned that visibility required risk, that being seen meant standing up even when standing hurt. She pressed send and immediately felt both relief and anxiety flood through her body. The email was gone, irretrievable. Her truth launched into the digital void toward her brother's inbox. Margaret closed her laptop and stood up, stretching her arms above her head, feeling taller somehow, as if speaking her mind had added inches to her spine. Whatever happened next, she had stopped being complicit in her own erasure. Richard called 3 hours later, his voice tight and defensive, demanding to know what Margaret meant by her accusations in the email. She remained calm, refusing to be drawn into an argument, instead asking simple questions about his perception of Thanksgiving and whether he thought she had been treated with respect. His responses were evasive, deflecting responsibility to Linda, claiming he hadn't noticed anything wrong, insisting Margaret was being too sensitive about minor social dynamics. Margaret listened patiently, recognizing the tactics he was using, the gaslighting attempts to make her doubt her own experience. When he finished talking, she said quietly that she wasn't asking him to agree with her feelings, only to acknowledge them, to recognize that she had been hurt, regardless of his intentions. Richard went silent for a long moment, and Margaret could hear him breathing heavily, processing this unfamiliar version of his sister who refused to apologize. He eventually said he would talk to Linda, that maybe things had gotten out of hand, but there was no real apology in his words, no genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Margaret thanked him for calling and ended the conversation, knowing that this was likely the best response she would receive. Some people were incapable of real accountability, and forcing it was exhausting, like trying to squeeze water from stones that had never held moisture. That evening, Linda sent a text message that was clearly written reluctantly, saying she hoped Margaret didn't take things personally and that family dynamics were always complicated. The non-apology apology was almost worse than silence, a performance of contrition without actual remorse. Margaret read the message 3 times, then deleted it without responding, refusing to validate this minimal effort as adequate or acceptable for the hurt caused. She spent the rest of the week focused on her work, meeting, editing, deadlines, and communicating with clients who actually valued her expertise and effort. The contrast between her professional relationships and family dynamics was stark. A reminder that respect was possible, that being valued wasn't an unreasonable expectation. Margaret found herself smiling more easily during work calls, her shoulders relaxing as she discussed projects with people who saw her clearly. Emma called on Friday to check in, and Margaret shared the developments since their last conversation. Emma was proud of her mother for sending the email and standing firm, though disappointed by Richard and Linda's inadequate responses. They discussed upcoming holidays, and Emma suggested that Margaret start her own traditions, creating celebrations with people who actually wanted her presence, not just her financial contributions to their events. The idea appealed to Margaret more than she expected. The possibility of redefining what family meant, choosing connection over obligation. She began researching volunteer opportunities for Christmas, thinking about spending holidays, serving meals at shelters, or visiting nursing homes, places where her presence might actually matter to people who would appreciate company and kindness. Purpose felt more valuable than performance, and Margaret was tired of performing. December arrived with early snow, and the pressure of holiday planning that Margaret usually felt was notably absent this year. She received an invitation to Richard's Christmas gathering, but responded simply that she had other plans. Without elaboration or explanation, Linda called asking what plans and if Margaret was trying to make some kind of point by skipping family events. And Margaret said calmly that she was simply choosing how to spend her time and money. The conversation grew tense as Linda accused Margaret of being vindictive and punishing the whole family for a simple misunderstanding about Thanksgiving. Margaret interrupted gently but firmly, explaining that she wasn't punishing anyone, merely redirecting her resources toward people and causes that aligned with her values. Linda sputtered something about family obligations and hung up abruptly, leaving Margaret staring at her phone with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had expected this response, the attempts to guilt and manipulate her back into compliance, but hearing it still stung. Margaret reminded herself that boundary setting always provoked resistance from people who benefited from your lack of boundaries, and their anger was not evidence that she was wrong. She called Patricia to debrief, and her friend reminded her that she was doing beautifully, that staying strong was the hardest part. That weekend, Margaret attended a community meeting about holiday volunteer programs and signed up for several opportunities throughout December. She met other volunteers, people of various ages and backgrounds who shared her desire to make the season meaningful through service. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years at family gatherings. Genuine belonging among people who chose to be together rather than people obligated by shared genetics. She mentioned her volunteer plans to David during their weekly phone call, and he immediately asked if he could join her for the Christmas Eve shelter shift. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at his offer. This simple gesture of support and solidarity, meaning more than any fancy dinner or expensive gift, they made plans to work together, and David suggested they start their own tradition of service that Emma could join the following year. The weeks passed quickly with work projects and volunteer training, and Margaret discovered that staying busy helped minimize the grief she felt about her fractured family relationships. Some losses were necessary for growth, and she was learning to mourn what could never be while celebrating what might still become possible. Her house felt peaceful rather than lonely, a sanctuary instead of a reminder of isolation. Jennifer called again, mentioning that Richard and Linda were complaining to other family members about Margaret's attitude and absence from holiday planning. Jennifer wanted Margaret to know that not everyone believed their version, that some relatives understood exactly what had happened and supported Margaret's decision to step back. This information helped, knowing she wasn't completely isolated, though Margaret also recognized that silent support wasn't the same as vocal advocacy. She thanked Jennifer for the call and for her honesty, acknowledging that speaking up came with social costs that not everyone could afford. Margaret understood why people stayed quiet in dysfunctional families, having done it herself for decades, and she didn't judge her relatives for choosing peace over principle. Everyone had to decide what they could live with, and she had finally reached her own limit of tolerance for disrespect. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, with stars visible in the darkening sky as Margaret and David drove to the shelter where they would serve dinner. They talked easily during the drive about his teaching and her editing, about Emma's semester at college, about their plans for a small, private Christmas celebration the next day. Margaret felt closer to her son in that car ride than she had to anyone at Thanksgiving dinner. The shelter was warm and crowded with volunteers and guests, the air filled with cooking smells and conversation. Margaret and David were assigned to serving tables, dishing out turkey and stuffing and vegetables to people who thanked them genuinely for each portion. The gratitude in their eyes was real and immediate, so different from the entitled expectations she had received from Richard and Linda, and Margaret understood with sudden clarity what had been missing from her family interactions. Between serving shifts, she talked with other guests, hearing stories of hardship and resilience, of families lost and found, of surviving circumstances that would have broken many people. Margaret listened with full attention, offering respect and recognition to individuals the world often overlooked, and she realized she had something in common with these strangers. They had all been invisible to people who should have seen them clearly. David worked beside her with the same gentle patience he brought to his teaching, treating every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Margaret watched her son with pride, knowing she had raised him right despite her own struggles, that her children had learned kindness from her example even when she hadn't applied those lessons to herself. Breaking cycles took courage, and she had managed to break at least this one. They left the shelter late that night, exhausted but satisfied, and David told his mother how proud he was of her for creating this new tradition. He said he had always known she deserved better from Richard and Linda, and he was glad she was finally believing it herself. Margaret hugged him tightly in the parking lot, this adult son who saw her clearly and loved her anyway, and felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. Christmas morning was quiet and simple, just Margaret and David exchanging small, meaningful gifts and cooking breakfast together. No performance was required, no pretense necessary, just genuine connection between two people who actually enjoyed each other's company. Emma video called from Vermont, and they laughed together over coffee and virtual presents, making plans for her to join them next year at the shelter. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Richard wishing her Merry Christmas and asking if she was deliberately trying to destroy the family by refusing to participate in gatherings. She showed the message to David, who shook his head in disgust at his uncle's manipulation. Margaret typed a response, saying she loved Richard but needed space to reconsider what family meant to her, and she hoped he could respect that boundary without making it about punishment. His response came minutes later, angry and accusatory, blaming her for being selfish and ungrateful after everything the family had done for her. Margaret read it aloud to David, hearing the absurdity of claiming she was ungrateful when she had funded family events for years without acknowledgement. David suggested she block Richard's number temporarily, and Margaret realized this might be necessary for her own peace, at least until Richard could communicate without hostility. She spent the afternoon reading and napping, allowing herself the luxury of unscheduled time without guilt or obligation. David made dinner and they ate while watching a movie neither of them had seen before, pausing occasionally to discuss plot points or character motivations. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she had felt this relaxed during the holidays, unburdened by the need to please people who couldn't be pleased. That evening, Patricia stopped by with wine and cookies, and the three of them sat around Margaret's living room talking about the year and making plans for the next. Patricia announced she was getting divorced after 27 years of marriage, ready to stop pretending she was happy with someone who made her miserable. Margaret and David listened supportively as she shared her decision, and Margaret recognized her own journey, reflected in Patricia's words. They talked late into the night about authenticity and courage, about the cost of staying in situations that diminished you and the price of leaving them. David eventually excused himself to bed, and Margaret and Patricia continued their conversation with the ease of old friends who had witnessed each other's transformations. Patricia said Margaret seemed lighter somehow, less burdened, and Margaret realized it was true. That releasing obligation had created space for possibility. The new year approached with typical winter weather in Massachusetts, snow accumulating and temperatures dropping, and Margaret found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just 6 weeks. She had attended a holiday dinner where she funded the meal but was treated as invisible, and that humiliation had paradoxically become the catalyst for her visibility. Forcing her to recognize patterns she had ignored for decades, she drafted a longer letter to Richard, more detailed than her initial email, explaining her perspective on their relationship and what she needed going forward. Margaret outlined clear boundaries, including that she would no longer provide financial support for family events unless her contributions were acknowledged and her presence was genuinely wanted. She explained that love without respect was insufficient, and she deserved both or neither, but not this half measure of tolerance without appreciation. The letter went through multiple revisions as Margaret worked to express herself without attacking, to state her needs without demanding that Richard meet them. She acknowledged her own role in creating this dynamic by accepting unacceptable treatment, and she took responsibility for changing that pattern regardless of whether Richard changed his behavior. This wasn't about forcing him to be different. It was about refusing to remain the same person she had been. Margaret printed the letter and read it one final time before sealing it in an envelope and mailing it to Richard's house. Email could be ignored or deleted, but a physical letter required acknowledgement, existed in material form as evidence of her perspective. She didn't know if Richard would read it with an open mind or defensive anger, but she had spoken her truth regardless of his response. January brought bitter cold and a renewed focus on Margaret's work and volunteer commitments. She found rhythm in her new routines, discovering that life without the drama of family dysfunction had a pleasant predictability. Her editing projects flourished as she devoted energy previously spent managing Richard and Linda's expectations to building her professional reputation and client relationships that were actually reciprocal and respectful. Emma returned to college after winter break, having spent a week with Margaret where they cooked together, watched movies, and talked honestly about family history and dynamics. Emma shared memories Margaret hadn't known her daughter carried, observations about how differently her mother was treated compared to other adults at family gatherings. Hearing these reflections confirmed Margaret's experiences and validated her decision to establish boundaries, even though implementing them remained difficult. David visited most weekends, often staying overnight and filling Margaret's house with the kind of easy companionship she had craved from her brother but never received. He sometimes mentioned Richard asking about Margaret through mutual acquaintances, but David had made clear to his uncle that rebuilding the relationship required genuine effort and accountability, not just time passing and expectation that Margaret would eventually forgive and forget without acknowledgement of harm. Patricia finalized her divorce and moved into a smaller apartment closer to Margaret, and they began meeting for coffee every Sunday morning to discuss their weeks and support each other's continued growth. They joked about being each other's chosen family, but underneath the humor was genuine truth, a recognition that blood relationships meant nothing if they didn't include mutual care and respect. While friendships built on authenticity were worth more than genetics, February arrived with a surprise phone call from Jennifer, who asked if she could meet Margaret for lunch. They met at a cafe halfway between their homes, and Jennifer immediately apologized for not speaking up during Thanksgiving for witnessing Margaret's mistreatment and saying nothing. She explained that she had been thinking about it constantly, feeling guilty for her complicity, and wanted to do better going forward, which meant having this uncomfortable conversation. Margaret appreciated Jennifer's honesty and apology, recognizing how rare it was for someone to acknowledge their own failings in family dynamics. They talked for 2 hours about the unspoken rules that governed their extended family, the ways Richard and Linda had created an atmosphere where disagreement felt impossible. Jennifer revealed that other relatives had similar grievances but feared retaliation, social exclusion if they challenged the established power structure. This information was both validating and frustrating for Margaret. Knowing she wasn't alone in her experience, but recognizing how many people chose complicity over courage. Jennifer asked if Margaret would consider attending the next family gathering with her support, promising to speak up if mistreatment occurred, but Margaret explained that she wasn't ready yet, that returning without genuine change from Richard and Linda would only repeat previous patterns. They parted with genuine warmth, Jennifer promising to stay in better contact and Margaret feeling grateful for this unexpected alliance. One person breaking the silence created space for others to speak, and perhaps her decision to establish boundaries was having ripple effects beyond her own immediate situation. Change rarely happened through single dramatic moments, but through accumulated small shifts in awareness and behavior. And maybe she had started something larger than herself. March brought warmer weather and the first signs of spring. Crocuses pushing through snow and birds returning to Margaret's feeders. She had survived her first winter without family obligations, without the stress of managing relationships that drained rather than sustained her. The absence of that pressure felt revolutionary, like discovering she had been carrying an invisible weight that she could simply put down whenever she chose to stop believing it was mandatory. Richard finally responded to her letter with one of his own, arriving on a Thursday afternoon when Margaret had just finished a particularly difficult editing project. She stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it, preparing herself for whatever contents awaited inside. His handwriting was familiar, the same careful script she remembered from childhood birthday cards, and she felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with trepidation. The letter was shorter than she expected, maybe a page and a half, and Richard's tone was different from their previous communications. He acknowledged that he had taken her for granted, that Linda's behavior at Thanksgiving was inappropriate, and that he should have defended Margaret instead of remaining silent. He admitted struggling to balance his loyalty to his wife with his love for his sister, and he understood if Margaret needed time before they could repair their relationship. What surprised Margaret most was his confession that their father had treated him similarly before his death, always expecting financial and emotional support without reciprocation, and Richard recognized he had repeated that pattern with her. He apologized specifically for the years of taking without giving, for assuming her generosity was endless and unconditional, for never expressing gratitude for everything she had provided. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was genuine, and Margaret felt something loosen in her chest as she read his words. She set the letter aside and made tea, needing time to process this unexpected development. Part of her wanted to immediately respond with forgiveness, to rush back into relationship because that's what she had always done, smoothing over conflict to restore surface harmony. But Margaret had learned that quick reconciliation often meant repeating old patterns, and genuine healing required patience, not just apology but changed behavior over time. She showed the letter to David during their next phone call, and he cautioned his mother against accepting words without evidence of different actions. He reminded her that people often apologized beautifully when facing consequences, but reverted to previous behavior once forgiveness restored their access. Margaret knew he was right, that Richard's letter was a beginning but not an ending, and she needed to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Margaret drafted a response over several days, thanking Richard for his honesty and acknowledging his apology while explaining that rebuilding trust would require time and consistent different behavior. She outlined what that might look like, including acknowledging her contributions publicly when they occurred, defending her when others disrespected her, and inviting her into decisions about family gatherings rather than informing her after plans were made. She was specific because vague expectations led to repeated disappointment. She also addressed Linda directly in the letter, explaining that any reconciliation with Richard needed to include his wife's genuine respect and inclusion. Margaret wasn't interested in being tolerated while remaining invisible, and Linda's behavior would need to demonstrate actual change. This might mean uncomfortable conversations and acknowledgement of past mistreatment. But Margaret had learned that avoiding discomfort only prolonged dysfunction, and she was finished protecting other people's feelings at the expense of her own dignity. The letter felt strong and clear as Margaret mailed it, neither cruel nor conciliatory, but honest about her boundaries and expectations. She had no idea if Richard and Linda would meet these conditions, but stating them clearly meant they couldn't later claim confusion about her requirements. Margaret had learned to communicate her needs explicitly, rather than hoping people would intuit them, and this directness felt empowering, even when uncomfortable. April brought her birthday, and Margaret decided to celebrate by hosting a small gathering of people who actually cared about her: Patricia, David, a few colleagues from her editing work, and Jennifer. She cooked her favorite meal and set her table with the good china she usually saved for theoretical special occasions, deciding that living fully meant using beautiful things rather than saving them for some day that might never arrive. The evening was filled with genuine laughter and conversation, people sharing stories and asking questions and actually listening to answers. No one checked their phone constantly or made her feel like an inconvenience, and Margaret realized this was what family should feel like: chosen connection based on mutual affection rather than obligatory attendance motivated by guilt or expectation. When everyone sang happy birthday, she felt tears of gratitude rather than the hollow performance she associated with Richard's family gatherings. David gave a toast celebrating his mother's courage in recent months, acknowledging how difficult it must have been to establish boundaries with family and praising her for teaching him through. Example what self-respect looked like. The guests raised their glasses, and Margaret felt seen in ways she had craved her entire life, recognized not for what she provided but for who she was. This was the gift she had really wanted every birthday: to matter to people who mattered to her. Richard sent a birthday card with a gift certificate to Margaret's favorite bookstore, a small gesture that acknowledged her interests in a way he rarely had before. The card included a brief note saying he was working on himself and hoped they could talk soon when she was ready. Margaret appreciated this patience, his recognition that reconciliation happened on her timeline, and she felt hopeful that maybe genuine change was possible after all. She used the gift certificate the following week, browsing the bookstore's shelves and selecting novels about women reinventing their lives after major transitions. Margaret had always been a reader, but lately she gravitated toward stories of transformation and courage, characters who chose themselves even when that choice was painful. These narratives reflected her own journey and reminded her that she wasn't alone in struggling to establish worthwhile boundaries and self-worth against familial expectations. May arrived with blooming flowers and longer days, and Margaret felt like she was emerging from a long winter in multiple senses. She had spent 6 months living differently, prioritizing her own well-being over other people's comfort, and the results were undeniable. Her stress levels had decreased significantly, her sleep had improved, her work was flourishing, and her relationships with Emma and David were stronger than ever because authenticity created space for genuine intimacy. Patricia commented during one of their Sunday coffee meetings that Margaret seemed transformed, lighter and more confident, and Margaret realized it was true. Establishing boundaries had changed something fundamental in how she moved through the world, affecting not just family dynamics but every interaction. She spoke up more in professional meetings, advocated for herself with difficult clients, and stopped apologizing for taking up space with her thoughts and needs, finally believing she deserved consideration. Jennifer called to invite Margaret to a small Mother's Day brunch she was hosting, mentioning that Richard and Linda wouldn't be there, that this was specifically an event for relatives who wanted to connect outside the toxic dynamics that dominated larger gatherings. Margaret accepted gratefully, appreciating Jennifer's continued effort to maintain relationship while respecting Margaret's boundaries. This felt like what healthy family could look like: people making space for each other's needs rather than demanding conformity. The brunch was lovely, intimate, and warm, with women sharing motherhood stories and supporting each other through various challenges. Margaret talked about raising Emma and David through her divorce, the difficulties of single parenting and building a career simultaneously, and several cousins expressed admiration for what she had accomplished. Their recognition meant more than Margaret expected: validation that her life had value beyond financial contributions to other people's celebrations and crises. She drove home feeling hopeful about the possibility of reconstructed family relationships on her own terms, connections based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Not everyone needed to be close, but basic human decency seemed like a reasonable minimum standard, and perhaps enough relatives shared that value to create a new kind of family culture. Change was slow and difficult, but it started with individuals refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. And Margaret had finally planted that flag firmly in the ground where everyone could see it. June brought an unexpected letter from Linda, the first direct communication Margaret had received from her sister-in-law since the non-apology text after Thanksgiving. Margaret approached the envelope with caution, unsure what to expect, and opened it sitting at her kitchen table with coffee, prepared for either genuine reconciliation or defensive justification. What she found was something in between: a complicated attempt at accountability that revealed Linda's own struggles with family dynamics. Linda wrote about growing up in a household where worth was measured by perfection, where any mistake brought harsh criticism, and how that had shaped her need to control situations and people. She acknowledged treating Margaret badly, Using her as a convenient target for insecurities Linda struggled to address directly. She explained but didn't excuse her behavior at Thanksgiving. Admitting that excluding Margaret's children while accepting her money was cruel and indefensible, the letter included specific apologies for incidents Margaret had almost forgotten but Linda clearly remembered. Small cruelties and dismissive comments accumulated over years of family interactions. Linda wrote that reading Richard's conversations with Margaret had forced her to examine her own behavior, and she didn't like what she saw. She asked for the opportunity to demonstrate change rather than just promise it, acknowledging that words were insufficient given the history between them. Margaret read the letter 3 times, trying to discern genuine remorse from manipulation, and ultimately deciding Linda's motivations mattered less than her future actions. People apologized for various reasons, but the value of an apology was measured in behavioral change, not emotional performance. Margaret could accept Linda's words while maintaining skeptical boundaries, allowing time to reveal whether this represented genuine transformation or temporary performance to restore family peace and access to Margaret's resources. She responded briefly, thanking Linda for her honesty and expressing willingness to slowly rebuild their relationship. If Linda's actions matched her stated intentions, Margaret suggested they start small, maybe coffee once a month without Richard present. Creating space for direct connection without the dynamics of larger family gatherings. She was specific about needing to see consistent respect before considering attendance at future holiday events, and Linda agreed to these terms without argument. Their first coffee meeting happened in late June at a neutral cafe, neither woman's territory, and the initial awkwardness gradually gave way to more honest conversation than they had ever shared. Linda talked about her own family history and struggles with perfectionism, and Margaret shared her experience of feeling invisible and taken for granted. They didn't solve decades of dysfunction in 2 hours, but they started a different kind of dialogue, one based on honesty rather than performance. Margaret left that meeting feeling cautiously optimistic, recognizing that Linda was making genuine effort even if the relationship might never become close. Sometimes peaceful coexistence was enough, respect without deep affection. And Margaret had learned to adjust her expectations based on what people could realistically provide. Not every relationship needed to be intimate, but every relationship needed to include basic human dignity, and Linda seemed finally willing to offer that minimum standard. July brought summer heat and a family reunion that Margaret had previously dreaded but now felt neutral about attending. Jennifer had assured her that the event would be different, that several relatives had talked to Richard and Linda about creating more inclusive dynamics. Margaret decided to attend, but planned to leave immediately if she felt disrespected. Having learned that staying in uncomfortable situations didn't make them better, it just normalized accepting mistreatment. She arrived with David, who had offered to accompany her for moral support, and immediately noticed subtle differences in how people greeted her. Relatives asked genuine questions about her work and life, and several mentioned missing her at Christmas and appreciating her past contributions to family events. Richard approached nervously and hugged her carefully as if afraid she might break or disappear. And Margaret felt his anxiety as evidence that her boundaries had registered as serious rather than temporary protest. Linda sought her out mid-afternoon, asking if they could talk privately, and led Margaret to a quiet corner of the yard. She apologized again for Thanksgiving, this time publicly within earshot of other relatives, acknowledging specifically that she had treated Margaret terribly and was working to do better. The public nature of the apology mattered, creating accountability and witnesses, making it harder to later deny or minimize what had been said. The reunion wasn't perfect. Old dynamics occasionally surfaced in subtle ways, but the overall atmosphere felt significantly different from previous gatherings. People made effort to include Margaret in conversations, and when Richard's teenage daughter started scrolling through her phone during dinner, Linda actually asked her to put it away and engage with family. These small shifts suggested genuine change rather than temporary performance, and Margaret felt her shoulders relax incrementally as the afternoon progressed. She left early as planned, not wanting to push her limits, but thanked Jennifer for her advocacy and Richard for his efforts. Richard walked her to her car and said quietly that he understood rebuilding trust took time, but he hoped she knew he loved her and was committed to being a better brother. Margaret nodded, accepting his words while reserving judgment for future actions, and drove home feeling like maybe, possibly, her family might eventually become a place where she could belong without disappearing. August passed in a haze of summer routines, editing work and volunteer commitments and weekly phone calls with Emma and David. Margaret had settled into her new normal, life structured around her own needs and values rather than other people's expectations. She occasionally met Linda for coffee, and their relationship remained cordial if not close. Two women learning to coexist with mutual respect if not deep affection, which Margaret had learned was perfectly acceptable. Patricia's divorce finalized, and they celebrated with dinner and wine, toasting new beginnings and hard-won wisdom. Patricia said Margaret had inspired her to finally leave her unhappy marriage. Seeing her friend establish boundaries and survive the consequences had given Patricia courage to do the same. Margaret felt honored by this acknowledgement, recognizing that personal transformation often inspired others. That courage was contagious when people witnessed it up close and saw that survival was possible. They talked late into the night about the future they were building. Two women in their 50s discovering that life didn't end when family relationships changed or marriages dissolved. If anything, Margaret felt more alive now than she had in decades, finally living authentically instead of performing roles that had never fit comfortably. She had spent 30 years being the person everyone else needed, and now she was learning to be the person she actually was, and the difference was revolutionary. September brought cooler weather and the start of a new school year, David returning to his teaching and Emma beginning her senior year at college. Margaret felt proud of her children, grateful they had learned healthier relationship patterns than the ones she had modeled for too long. They called regularly, checking on her well-being and sharing their lives, treating her with the respect and consideration she had finally learned to require from everyone in her life. Richard invited her to dinner at his house, just the two of them without Linda, and Margaret accepted with some trepidation. They cooked together, something they hadn't done since childhood, and talked honestly about their parents and family history. Richard admitted that their father had been emotionally distant and financially demanding, expecting Richard to fund family obligations without appreciation, and Richard recognized he had repeated that pattern with Margaret without realizing it until she forced the recognition. They discussed Thanksgiving and the months that followed. Richard acknowledging how badly he had failed her as a brother, he explained that Linda's insecurity had driven much of her behavior, but he should have defended Margaret regardless of his wife's feelings. He was working in therapy to understand his conflict avoidance and people-pleasing tendencies, patterns that had damaged his most important relationships. Margaret appreciated his honesty and his commitment to personal growth, recognizing that real change required professional support, not just good intentions. She shared her own journey toward establishing boundaries, the difficulty of prioritizing herself after decades of conditioning to consider everyone else first. They talked about the family culture they inherited and whether they could create something healthier for the next generation. Richard expressed hope that they could model different dynamics, show Emma and David and his own children that family could be both honest and loving, that respect and affection weren't mutually exclusive. Margaret left that evening feeling like she had her brother back, not the person he had been recently, but someone closer to the boy she remembered from childhood. Relationships could be repaired if both people committed to the work, and Richard seemed genuinely committed despite the discomfort. Trust took time to rebuild, but foundation was being laid brick by careful brick, and Margaret felt hopeful about what they might eventually construct together on more solid ground. October arrived with brilliant fall foliage, and Margaret found herself genuinely looking forward to Thanksgiving this year. Richard and Linda had asked if she would help plan the celebration, actually involving her in decisions rather than just expecting financial contribution. Margaret agreed but insisted on several conditions, including that Emma and David be explicitly welcomed and honored, and that her contributions be publicly acknowledged during the meal itself. Linda readily agreed to these terms, suggesting they host together and split responsibilities, and Margaret accepted this compromise. Planning the meal became a collaborative effort, with multiple relatives contributing dishes and time. Distributing the burden rather than concentrating it on one person, Margaret felt the difference immediately. Inclusion instead of exploitation. Partnership rather than being taken for granted, and she understood this was what family celebrations should have felt like all along. She invited Patricia to join them for Thanksgiving, wanting her friend to experience what healthy family dynamics could look like when people actually made effort. Patricia accepted gratefully, joking that she needed to see evidence that functional families existed before she lost faith completely. Margaret laughed but understood the sentiment, having questioned whether respect and affection could coexist in family systems. Whether she was asking for something impossible rather than something basic and reasonable. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving felt lighter than previous years. Anticipation instead of dread, hope rather than resignation. Margaret continued her editing work and volunteer commitments. Maintaining the life she had built when family had felt impossible, she had learned not to make family her entire existence, to have independent purpose and community so that no single relationship could devastate her if it failed. And this diversification had created resilience she never had before. Emma called regularly as Thanksgiving approached, asking about plans and expressing excitement about spending the holiday with family that had finally learned to treat her mother with respect. Emma admitted she had dreaded family gatherings for years, witnessing how they treated Margaret and feeling powerless to intervene. Now she actually looked forward to attending, curious to see if the changes her mother described would be evident, or if this was temporary performance that would eventually revert to previous patterns. Margaret acknowledged that possibility, explaining that she remained cautiously optimistic but prepared to leave immediately if she felt disrespected. She had learned to prioritize her own well-being over maintaining appearances, and she would no longer tolerate mistreatment just to preserve surface harmony. Emma said she was proud of her mother for finally establishing boundaries, for teaching by example what self-respect looked like in practice, and Margaret felt validated by her daughter's support and understanding. Thanksgiving morning arrived clear and cold, and Margaret woke early to begin food preparation. She had agreed to make several dishes, and she cooked with genuine pleasure rather than resentful obligation. Linda arrived mid-morning to help, and they worked together companionably. Their relationship, still somewhat formal, but significantly improved from the hostility that had previously characterized their interactions. Progress was visible in small gestures, Linda asking Margaret's opinion and actually listening, thanking her for specific contributions without prompting. Emma and David arrived early afternoon, and Margaret felt her heart swell watching her children embrace their uncle and aunt. Family connection without the toxicity that had previously poisoned these gatherings. Richard made special effort to talk with Emma about college and David about teaching, showing genuine interest in their lives rather than perfunctory questions. These small attentions mattered, evidence that he understood relationship required investment, not just expectation that connection existed because of shared genetics. The house gradually filled with relatives, and Margaret noticed Jennifer immediately seek her out, greeting her warmly and introducing her to Jennifer's adult children who had heard about Margaret's advocacy for change in family dynamics. Several cousins thanked Margaret for speaking up, explaining that her courage had created space for others to also establish healthier boundaries. She hadn't realized her personal struggle had become catalyst for broader family transformation, that individual actions could have collective impact. Dinner was served at 6 o'clock around the same extended table where Margaret had felt invisible a year ago. But everything felt different now. Linda welcomed everyone and specifically thanked Margaret for her contributions, financial and otherwise, to making this celebration possible. Richard added his own acknowledgement, expressing gratitude for his sister's generosity over the years and apologizing for taking it for granted. The room went silent for a moment, then applause broke out. Relatives recognizing the significance of this public accountability, Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from relief, from finally receiving the acknowledgement she had craved for decades. Emma reached over and squeezed her hand, and David smiled at her from across the table, her children witnessing their mother being valued and respected. Patricia caught her eye and mouthed, "You did it," and Margaret nodded slightly, understanding that she had indeed accomplished something significant by refusing to remain invisible. The meal proceeded with genuine warmth, conversations flowing naturally without the undercurrent of tension that had characterized previous gatherings. Margaret participated fully, sharing stories and laughing at jokes, feeling present in ways she never had before in this family context. Several people asked about her editing work, expressing real interest rather than dismissive politeness, and she found herself talking enthusiastically about projects she had completed and clients she enjoyed working with. Professional identity finally recognized alongside her familial role. As dessert was served, Richard stood and offered a toast, specifically honoring Margaret, acknowledging the ways she had supported the family through various crises and celebrations. He spoke about his own failings as a brother and his commitment to doing better, and he thanked her for having the courage to demand the respect she deserved. Linda added her own thanks, apologizing again for past behavior and expressing commitment to building genuine relationship, rather than surface civility. Margaret stood to respond, her voice steady, despite emotion, thanking everyone for their efforts to create healthier family dynamics. She acknowledged that change was difficult and required courage from everyone, not just her, and she appreciated those who had spoken up and supported transformation. She expressed hope that this Thanksgiving marked a new beginning, not just for her relationship with Richard and Linda, but for the entire family's ability to combine honesty with love, respect with affection. The evening continued with card games and conversation, relatives lingering longer than usual, as if reluctant to leave this rare atmosphere of genuine connection. Margaret found herself in multiple small conversations where people shared their own struggles with family dynamics and appreciated her modeling of healthy boundaries. She realized her personal journey had inadvertently given others permission to also advocate for themselves. And perhaps that was the most meaningful outcome of this entire difficult year. As guests departed, Richard and Linda asked Margaret to stay for a final conversation, and the four of them, including Patricia, sat in the living room with coffee. Richard explained that he and Linda had discussed selling their vacation property and using the proceeds to establish a family emergency fund that would distribute the burden of financial crises rather than depending primarily on Margaret. This gesture moved Margaret deeply. Recognition that support should be mutual and systematic rather than one-directional and exploitative. Linda added that she was working with a therapist on her control issues and people-pleasing tendencies, and she hoped Margaret would be patient with her as she learned healthier communication patterns. Margaret appreciated this vulnerability and assured Linda that she understood change took time, that she wasn't expecting perfection but rather consistent effort and genuine respect. The conversation felt honest and constructive, relationships being rebuilt on foundation of mutual accountability rather than unexamined habits and assumptions. Patricia spoke up, thanking them for including her and for the example they were setting, a family willing to do hard work to repair relationships. She shared briefly about her own recent divorce and how Margaret's courage had inspired her to finally leave an unhappy marriage. Linda expressed support and offered friendship, suggesting they meet for coffee together with Margaret. This unexpected offer of expanded connection pleased Margaret, seeing her closest friend welcomed into family rather than kept separate. They talked late into the night, eventually shifting to lighter topics and shared laughter, and Margaret realized this was what she had been seeking all along. Not perfection, but genuine effort. Not immediate transformation, but consistent movement toward healthier dynamics. When she finally left with Patricia and her children, Margaret felt grateful for the difficult year that had brought her to this place, the humiliation that had sparked necessary change. The drive home was quiet, everyone processing the evening's events, and Emma eventually said from the back seat that she was proud of Margaret for not giving up on family, even when they gave her every reason to do so. David added that she had taught them valuable lessons about setting boundaries while remaining open to reconciliation. When people demonstrated genuine change, Margaret felt validated by her children's observations, knowing she had modeled something worthwhile despite the difficulty. She dropped Patricia at her apartment with plans to debrief over Sunday coffee, then drove home with Emma and David for a quiet end to an emotionally intense day. They made tea and sat together in Margaret's living room, the space that had felt lonely a year ago, now filled with the people who actually mattered. She had learned that family wasn't defined by genetics alone, but by who showed up consistently with respect and love. And sometimes you had to lose your biological family temporarily to discover your actual family. The months that followed brought continued growth in Margaret's relationships with Richard and Linda, trust slowly rebuilding through consistent effort and changed behavior. They met regularly for dinners and coffee, gradually developing genuine friendship alongside their sibling connection. Linda proved committed to therapy and personal growth, and Margaret witnessed real transformation in how her sister-in-law communicated and interacted with others. Change was possible when people truly committed to it, and Linda's dedication impressed Margaret deeply. Christmas arrived with an invitation to celebrate together, and this time Margaret agreed without reservation, confident that the changes she had witnessed would hold. The celebration was warm and inclusive, with Emma and David fully embraced and Margaret's contributions acknowledged naturally throughout the day. She had successfully renegotiated her place in the family from invisible benefactor to valued member, and the difference was evident in every interaction. As the new year approached, Margaret reflected on her transformation over the past 14 months. From the woman who had swallowed humiliation at Thanksgiving to someone who had established clear boundaries and insisted on respect. The journey had been painful but necessary, teaching her that visibility required courage. That being valued meant refusing to accept being taken for granted. She had learned that sometimes the only way to change a relationship was to risk losing it completely, and she had been brave enough to take that risk. Patricia called on New Year's Eve to thank Margaret for her friendship and support through her divorce, and they made plans to celebrate together with Emma and David. Margaret felt surrounded by chosen family, people who actually wanted her presence and valued her existence. She had stopped searching for home in places where she wasn't truly welcome, and in doing so, she had created home wherever she went, carrying it inside herself, rather than depending on external validation. She spent New Year's Day alone, a choice rather than a consequence, enjoying quiet reflection and planning for the year ahead. Margaret had learned to appreciate solitude without mistaking it for loneliness, to find peace in her own company after decades of believing she needed constant connection to have value. The woman she was becoming felt stronger and clearer than the woman she had been, and she looked forward to continuing this evolution regardless of who chose to join her on the journey. Jennifer called that evening to say she had noticed profound changes in family dynamics since Margaret had established boundaries, and several relatives were following her example in their own relationships. Margaret felt honored to have catalyzed positive change, though she acknowledged it had never been her intention to inspire others, only to protect herself. Sometimes personal liberation had collective benefits, and she was grateful that her struggle had made space for others to also advocate for themselves. February brought Valentine's Day and a thoughtful card from Richard expressing gratitude for Margaret's persistence in demanding better from him, acknowledging that her courage had saved their relationship rather than destroying it. He wrote that he had feared losing her completely when she first established boundaries, but he now understood that real connection required honesty and respect, that relationships without those foundations weren't worth maintaining regardless of biological ties. Margaret treasured this card more than any expensive gift. Validation that her difficult decisions had ultimately created the authentic relationship she had always wanted. She continued her volunteer work at the shelter, finding purpose in service that had nothing to do with family obligation or professional achievement. The people she met there taught her about resilience and dignity, about maintaining humanity in circumstances that stripped away everything except essential character. Margaret felt more connected to these strangers than she had ever felt at family gatherings where everyone shared her genetics, and she understood that real connection transcended circumstance and biology, existing in moments of genuine presence and mutual recognition. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and Margaret planted flowers in her garden, creating beauty that would bloom through summer and into fall. She worked the soil with her hands, feeling grounded and purposeful, no longer needing external validation to confirm her worth. The work itself was satisfying, watching life emerge from careful attention and consistent care. She had learned to apply this same patience to her relationships, trusting that consistent effort eventually yielded growth, even when progress seemed slow. Emma graduated from college in May, and the entire family attended the ceremony, including Richard, Linda, David, Patricia, and Jennifer. Margaret felt proud watching her daughter walk across that stage, knowing Emma had witnessed her mother's transformation and learned valuable lessons about self-respect and boundaries. After the ceremony, Emma introduced her family to professors and friends, and Margaret noticed how differently Emma presented them compared to previous years, with genuine pride rather than apologetic embarrassment. They celebrated with a dinner where everyone contributed to honoring Emma's achievement, sharing favorite memories and expressing excitement about her future. The conversation felt easy and genuine, so different from the forced performances that had characterized previous family celebrations. Margaret caught Richard's eye across the table and smiled, acknowledging silently how far they had come, and he smiled back with warmth that reached his eyes. Authentic connection finally replacing obligatory performance. Summer brought lazy weekends and quiet routines. Margaret finding joy in simple pleasures that didn't require audience or validation. She read books on her back porch, tended her garden, completed editing projects that challenged and satisfied her, and maintained relationships with people who actually valued her presence. Life felt full in ways it never had when she was focused on pleasing family members who couldn't be pleased regardless of her efforts. She met Linda for coffee monthly, and their relationship continued evolving into something approaching friendship. Two women who had learned to see past initial assumptions and appreciate each other's struggles. Linda shared her own family history of emotional abuse and perfectionism, and Margaret understood better why she had behaved so controlling and dismissive. Understanding didn't excuse past behavior, but it created context for compassion, and Margaret found herself genuinely wishing Linda well on her healing journey. David announced his engagement in July, and Margaret felt joy unmixed with the anxiety that had characterized previous family milestones. She met his fiancée Sarah at a dinner where the entire family gathered, and everyone made genuine effort to welcome this new member. Margaret watched carefully for signs of the toxic dynamics that had once dominated these gatherings, but the atmosphere remained warm and inclusive, evidence that change had been sustainable rather than temporary performance. Richard pulled Margaret aside during the evening and thanked her again for refusing to accept mistreatment, explaining that her courage had forced him to examine not just how he treated her, but how he approached all his relationships. He said he was becoming the person he had always wanted to be, but had been too afraid to pursue. And Margaret felt gratified knowing her personal transformation had contributed to his growth. Change was indeed contagious when people were willing to look honestly at their own behavior. Fall arrived with its familiar beauty, leaves turning colors and air growing crisp, and Margaret realized that almost 2 years had passed since the Thanksgiving that had catalyzed everything. She had survived what felt impossible at the time, had established boundaries that seemed unimaginably difficult, and had emerged stronger and clearer about who she was and what she deserved. The journey had been painful but ultimately liberating, teaching her that sometimes falling apart was necessary before you could build yourself back better. As November approached, Richard and Linda invited her to help plan Thanksgiving again, and Margaret agreed with none of the trepidation she had felt the previous year. She had reclaimed her place in the family through honest communication and firm boundaries, and now she participated as valued member rather than exploited benefactor. The difference wasn't subtle, it was transformative, and it reminded Margaret daily that speaking up had been worth every uncomfortable moment. She called Emma and David to coordinate their attendance, and both expressed genuine excitement about the celebration, no longer dreading family gatherings but actually looking forward to them. David mentioned bringing Sarah, and Emma asked if she could bring her new girlfriend Rachel. Margaret felt joy at her children's openness about their lives and relationships, grateful they felt safe being authentic with family, something she had spent decades unable to do herself until recently. Patricia would join them again, having become integrated into the family over the past year through regular gatherings and genuine friendship with several relatives. Margaret appreciated how naturally her friend had been embraced, evidence that the family was capable of authentic connection when they chose effort over dysfunction. She had learned that people could change when properly motivated, that establishing boundaries wasn't cruel but necessary for relationships to become healthy and sustainable. Thanksgiving arrived warm and bright, unusually mild for late November in Massachusetts, and Margaret woke early, feeling grateful rather than anxious. She dressed carefully and drove to Richard's house, where Linda was already preparing food in the kitchen. They worked together companionably, conversation flowing naturally, and Margaret realized they had become friends in truth, no longer just family members forced together by obligation and genetics. The house gradually filled with relatives, old and new, everyone contributing dishes and time and genuine enthusiasm. Emma introduced Rachel to family members who welcomed her warmly, asking interested questions and making real effort to know her. David and Sarah helped set the long table, laughing together over something private, and Margaret felt surrounded by love that was finally both genuine and mutual. Relationships built on respect rather than exploitation or performance. When dinner was served, Richard again acknowledged Margaret publicly, but this time his gratitude felt earned rather than performative. Recognition of ongoing contribution rather than belated apology for past mistreatment. Margaret accepted his thanks graciously, feeling valued in ways she had craved her entire life. She looked around the table at faces that had once made her feel invisible, and saw instead people who had learned to actually see her, and she understood that everything she had endured to reach this moment had been worth it.